Hi everybody, my name is Jim. I'm an alcoholic, also known as a dipsomaniac. Ever heard that term? Dipsomaniac? It's alcoholic mania. It's well, they used to put people away forever, with that. In fact, that was what was on Ebby's in his future. A couple of months before he came and talked to Bill, he was going to be committed basically for life to a mental institution as a dipsomaniac. And that was when Roland Hazard appeared for him and got the judge to parole Ebby into his custody, and then introduced him to the Oxford group. And 2 months later, Ebby was in Bill's apartment and got Bill started, and the rest, as they say, is history. Last week and the week before, we were looking at sponsorship as an avocation or a duty, a commitment that we make. Hi everybody, my name is Jim. I'm an alcoholic, also known as a dipsomaniac. Ever heard that term? Dipsomaniac? It's alcoholic mania. It's well, they used to put people away forever, with that. In fact, that was what was on Ebby's in his future. A couple of months before he came and talked to Bill, he was going to be committed basically for life to a mental institution as a dipsomaniac. And that was when Roland Hazard appeared for him and got the judge to parole Ebby into his custody, and then introduced him to the Oxford group. And 2 months later, Ebby was in Bill's apartment and got Bill started, and the rest, as they say, is history. Last week and the week before, we were looking at sponsorship as an avocation or a duty, a commitment that we make. We looked at the roots of sponsorship, what it is and what it's not. And last week we took a look at some of the mythology that surrounds AA and sponsorship, and I guess a lot of people got upset with some of the things that were said, but I believe that all of that came right from the book. So, in any event, I'm not here to cater to anybody, but I'm not here either to be a dog in the manger. I'm not at all happy if people get unhappy with what's going on. I'm just hoping that we'll be able to take our differences and compare them, and what I hope to do is to stay strictly with the big book, and I try very hard that whatever I say is I can back it up. Right in the middle of the page, 4 lines up from the bottom of that middle paragraph. Some of us have taken very hard knocks to learn this truth. Job or no job, wife or no wife, we simply do not stop drinking so long as we place dependence on other people ahead of dependence on God. Burn the idea in the conscience of every man that he can get well regardless of anyone. The only condition is he trust in God and clean house. I don't know what we don't understand about that. It's so clear, isn't it? Now remember back in Bill's story, he told us about this same thing. Take a look on page 12, please. I'm sorry, page 14. Top of page 14, 3 lines down from the top. Simple but not easy, a price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. And then every time we hear chapter 5 being read, we need to listen to what it's saying, because chapter 5 doesn't pull any punches at all. It tells us exactly how the cow ate the cabbage. tells us that we're not going to recover if we are unwilling or unable to be honest with ourselves. Tells us that if we want what we see in others, then, right then, not a year from now, but right then, we're ready to take certain steps. And then it tells us that some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. What part of absolutely don't we understand? This is a complete house cleaning. Everything we have, whatever we have to change about ourselves is just everything. Everything I knew when I got here was wrong. Not that the people who taught me were trying to lie, they just didn't know any better. I was taught that if I wanted to be safe and secure and happy in life, I had to have an education and a career. I had to acquire things, I had to make money, and I had to learn how to influence and captivate people. And all that was a lie. As soon as I had accomplished all of that, the fears became so crushing that I was overwhelmed. I was afraid of losing what I had and not getting what I thought I needed. I became afraid of economic insecurity, afraid of failure, and afraid of the consequences of my actions, and I'd be found out for what I did, and on and on and on and on. Chapter 5 goes on to tell us, half measures availed us nothing. We stood at the turning point. We asked His protection and care with complete abandon. And then every time we hear chapter 5 being read, we're given the answer. A great promise. And it just kind of sneaks by, but we need to think what this is saying. This is what we need to teach our sponsees, because, see, if they know what they're looking at here and what they're hearing, it's going to be so much help to them. The 3 pertinent ideas. They lay out the problem for us, that we're alcoholics. With all that entails, we have a disease which is going to kill us. And it's incurable. And it's progressive. And that no human power could relieve our alcoholism. God can and will if we seek Him. What a promise. That God can and will relieve us of the obsession and compulsion to drink alcohol, and all we have to do is seek Him. Why aren't we teaching people that? The simple solution. And how do we go about seeking God? The whole big book lays it out. We work the steps. What are we going to have when we've finished with the steps of spiritual awakening? What does that mean? We will have entered the world of the Spirit. We will have become God conscious. We will have been restored to sanity. We will have developed a vital sixth sense which gives us a direct connection. We can be inspired. We can be intuitively inspired. We can go to God and ask God for help. Ask Him to show us what our next step is to be, and if we're willing to listen, we'll get the answer. The big book says that the right answer will come if we want it. And all of these things that are here in the big book are not theory. They're not philosophy. They're experience. This book is a history. If we read it as such, then we know what we're reading. This is a history of those who went before, those who helped to write the book. What they're telling us is this is what we did. And we have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And we truly believe that if you do what we did, you too will recover from that seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And the obsession, compulsion to drink alcohol will be removed. And you will find that your disease of alcoholism has been placed in remission to remain there for the rest of your life, so long as you remain spiritually fit. Such a simple message, isn't it? And that's what the big book was written to tell us. And every time we read it and every time we begin to apply it in our own lives or to help others to apply it in their lives, we ought to remember that that's what we're reading. In the last paragraph on page 43, this is the only paragraph in the big books that I know of that states the possibility of an exception. And so we need to be aware that this is here. Once more, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense against the first drink. Of course, that would mean swearing off. That would mean just not drinking and going to meetings and all that other stuff. Because we have no effective mental defense against the first drink, and the first drink is what gets us drunk. Now, here's the exception. Except in a few rare cases, neither he nor any other human being can provide such a defense. The defense must come from a higher power. Now, I recognize that the book states the possibility or the probability of there being those few rare exceptions. And therefore, there are people who have experienced recovery, who have not used the big book or the steps, or have used other methods of recovery, and for them the experience has been good. I would like to suggest this to you, however. There are, since the big book was written, several million people have recovered. And there are probably somewhere between 4 and 5 million people in recovery now at any one time, although to get an actual count on them is impossible. In addition to that, there are some 30 or 40 or maybe even 50 12-step programs out there covering just about every known human problem. And you got to ask yourself, why is that so? Well, the obvious answer is that the 12 steps work. And there's another interesting facet here too, that if we look at the time when the big book was written, there could very well have been many doubters. It might have been quite logical to suggest that these guys really didn't know what they were talking about. That was in 1939 or 1940. In 2003, when we look back on these millions of recoveries, I suppose it would be quite logical then for us to say, yeah, these steps do work. This is the method of recovery which has worked for everybody who's used it. Dr. Bob, by the way, made it quite clear in his story. Remember, and he wasn't, Dr. Bob was a dead honest guy, and he made a flat statement. In talking about the 12 steps in his story, he said, it never fails. If we go about it with one half the zeal we used to go about getting our next drink. And that's the truth. So now, when we think about being sponsors, let's not think in terms of the rare exception, because our responsibility is to our sponsees. And if we know that there is something that works for everybody, it always works for those who do it, why would we think about teaching somebody whose life is in the balance anything else? I'd like to also point out something to you. There is a book called Living Sober. This book here. Now, Living Sober apparently was written for treatment centers and others using human solutions, because it is not big book and it's not steps. Here's what it says, the very first sentence. This booklet does not offer a plan for recovery from alcoholism. The Alcoholics Anonymous steps that summarize its program of recovery are set forth in detail in the books Alcoholics Anonymous and 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. Those steps are not interpreted here, nor are the processes they cover discussed in this booklet. Now, there's a lot of stuff in here which is now repeated as if it were part of the program of recovery, but it hasn't anything to do with the steps of the big book. And I suggest this to you, respectfully, that if what Dr. Bob said was true, and if the millions of recoveries mean anything, then we as sponsors, in discharging our obligations, our responsibilities, our mission to carry this message to other alcoholics, need to stick to the big book and stick to the steps. Therefore, in this workshop, that's what we will concentrate on. This is not to say in any way that I denigrate anyone's method of recovery or whatever they've learned in their experience, and I treat it as being valid. But I want to be sure we all understand each other. The only method of recovery I know is the 12 steps that's set forth in the Big Book. And so that's what I plan to teach. And I've been doing this now for 14 years, so I'm pretty well set in my ways, guys. And I'm hopeful that, at least in part, even those who may doubt now the efficacy of the steps of the Big Book to affect recovery will see with an open mind that there are some things here which may be quite essential to recovery. Okay, let's think about some of the other stuff that floats around. For example, don't have a relationship for a year. My goodness, where in the world did that come from? It makes it kind of strange, doesn't it, that we've got a whole chapter entitled To the Family Afterward. I suppose that means that if you're married, you leave your home and your wife, your husband, and any kids that happen to be there, then you stay away for a year. And if you think that's far-fetched, it's not. I've seen examples of it. I saw an example of that not too long ago. Well, now it's been several years. In one of the meetings down in South Dade. It was birthday night, and this beautiful young lady was sitting in the back of the room with her husband and a couple of kids. Her sponsor got up to introduce her, and she said that she had this wonderful year of recovery. She said, "I'm so proud of her. I told her she had to stay completely away from her family for a whole year. And she did that. And I looked at those children who had been deprived of their mother for a year, and the husband who hadn't had his wife for a year. And I almost lost it right there. And I stood up and I said, gee whiz, I wonder, where did that come from? By what right do we separate families when the Big Book tells us that the family is sacrosanct? It is something that we work so hard to preserve. And one of the most important things that we do with our family is that we carry the message to them so that the family can grow spiritually together. And by our example, they can learn. How dare you do that? Well, I made a lifelong enemy, I know. But that's how strongly I felt about it. You see, if we take that at face value, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what has a year got to do with anything? I can show you people right now with 20 years sobriety who have no business being in a relationship with anybody. They simply are not capable of having a relationship on any kind of a rational basis with another human being, especially not a sex relation. And there are others who have been around here for a few weeks and they have had they've gotten the alcohol in their system, they've read the book and they're starting to work the steps, and they've got it already. They're able right then to pick up whatever relationship they had going, provided of course it was a healthy one, which is a big proviso. Most of the time they're not, we know that. But that begs the question, what did we just read back there in Bill's story? I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. What do we read in chapter 5 in the fourth step? That if we have any doubts or if we're not sure what to do in a sex relationship situation, what do? It tells us in our morning meditation, we ask God what we should do about each particular matter, and that the right answer will come if we want it. It tells us that God alone can judge our sex problems. We don't have the power nor the right to do that. And 1 year is just an insult to injury because it means absolutely nothing. How about don't make a major decision for a year? Oh, but sponsor, gee whiz, I've got this opportunity to move to the West Coast and I have a major promotion, and if I don't go, they're going to fire me. I'm sorry, you can't go. You can't make any of those major decisions for a year. Well, where in the hell did that year come from? what relevance does that have? If we look back in the literature, guys, you know what we find? We find that people with 6 months sobriety in the early days were already experienced 12-steppers. In fact, Bill writes about that. You ask any AA of 6 months, he said, who has been working, doing this 12-step with people, and he'll tell you so and so and so and so. He made reference to it quite. Stop and think about this. The longest length of sobriety in the fellowship at the time the big book was written was 3.5 years. And many people who helped to write this book didn't have a year's sobriety, and many didn't have 6 months sobriety. And yet we have people running around saying, well, it takes you 5 years before you get the cobwebs out. Balderdash. Total nonsense. With some people it may be true, but to state a general rule like that? How did the big book get written if that's true? Well, the answer to that is obvious, isn't it? That simply is not true. It's not true. It's not true. It's something, these things get repeated over and over again to a point where, God, they become true just by being repeated. Then there's this other one. This one is a killer. Only men can sponsor men, and only women can sponsor women. And people take this as being true. Well, let's see. First woman in AA was Marty Mann. Marty Mann came in right about the same time that Bill was writing the first draft of the Big Book. In fact, he had completed that draft, the manuscript, if you wish. It was then reproduced on multilith, and Marty Mann contacted him and asked him for a copy. And we have a copy of his letter to her, where he sent her the multilith copy of his original draft and charged her $3.50 with the promise that if she, when the Big Book was finally printed in hardcover, that she would receive a book free of charge. Now, Marty Mann was the first woman. How in the world did Marty Mann ever get sober? None of the men there could help her. They couldn't sponsor her or become her spiritual advisor. Now, this is repeated over and over and over and over again. As the fellowship grew, the first women to come into any group would have been frozen out. It's pure nonsense. But you see, so much of this stuff comes out of fear. It comes out of the fear that a woman is going to be vulnerable to a man who sponsors her, and we got this specter of the 13th step and all that stuff. Well, hell's bells, if a guy wants the 13th step around here, he doesn't have to be anybody's sponsor. He's got every opportunity to do, and plenty of them do. That only a woman knows what another woman is going through. Well, there's nothing to say that a woman ought not to have women advisors, or a woman sponsor for that matter. It's the rule that's wrong. And there are many, many, many examples of wonderful, wonderful women sponsors who have sponsored men very successfully. There just isn't any such general rule. It's wrong. And for us to lay these things down as a rule means that we're cutting ourselves off to a single gender that we can sponsor. Well, why? There's no reason for it. The reasons are all specious, because they're all based upon fear, or perhaps upon the need or necessity of one of the genders to preserve its position. That may have something to do with it, I don't know. But that's not really relevant. The question is, where is it in the Big Book? Now here's the real question we ask ourselves, and we teach our sponsees this, because they're going to be bedeviled on all sides by people with all kinds of advice and all sorts of stuff that they'll come at them with. Tell them, look, when you hear something and you're not sure whether it's right or not, just ask the person, where's that in the Big Book? And then the second question, where is God in that equation? And if it's not in the book and God's not there, it ain't AA. It's something else, but it's not AA. And I tell the people I sponsor, you can safely ignore it. because what we need to know to recover is right here. Remember that this book was written to go out to people who had no groups, who were going to have to pick up this book and follow the directions in this book all the way through to a spiritual awakening as recovery. And in the 11th chapter, a good part of that chapter is devoted to showing these people with no group who are out there in Cucamonga or in Grand Rapids or someplace where there's no AA, how they could get their own group started. By giving the example of how the group started in New York and in Akron. It shows them this is what you do to get a group started. Nevertheless, the book was written for somebody to pick up, read, and follow the directions and recover. This is not to say that sponsorship is not critically important. Obviously it is. Somewhere along the line, the person who recovers by themselves using this book is going to have to find others to work with. Now, what is the basis of our need to sponsor? Go back to page 14, please. Now, Bill found this out right away, early on. And when you and I are sitting here and we spend all these weeks together learning how to carry this message, how to sponsor successfully and effectively, we have to remember the antecedents of sponsorship. Where did it come from? Bill was lying in the hospital, remember, for the last time. He'd been there twice before. And he had worked all the steps except the 12th step with Ebby. He reports that on page 13. On page 14, we find that while he's still in the hospital, he was inspired to understand that he was going to have to do something with what he had been given. Here's what he says. While I lay in the hospital, the thought came that there were thousands of hopeless alcoholics who might be glad to have what had been so freely given me. Perhaps I could help some of them. They in turn might work with others. And so he talked to Ebby, his friend, about it. He said, my friend had emphasized the absolute necessity of demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. That's 12th step, isn't it? Particularly was it imperative to work with others as he had worked with me. Look at the word imperative. Absolutely necessary. Faith without works was dead, he said. Doesn't matter how much faith we've acquired. We don't put it to work. If we don't actively trust God in all of our affairs, our faith is useless. It's dead. Faith without works is dead. And how appallingly true, Bill says, for the alcoholic. And here's the rule. This is the basis upon which we all must operate. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he could not survive the certain trials and low spots ahead. If he did not work, he would surely drink again, and if he drank, he would surely die. Then faith would be dead. Indeed, with us, it is just like that. Now, there are a number of other things that our founders found to be true. Let's take an example on page 25, please. You'll hear people say all the time, now I have choices. This choices thing is a favorite gimmick of the human solutions. Down at the bottom of page 25, about 10 lines up from the bottom, if you are as seriously alcoholic as we were, we believe there is no middle-of-the-road solution. We were in a position where life was becoming impossible. And if we had passed into the region from which there is no return through human aid, we had but two alternatives. Now here's the choice. These are the choices you and I have. One was to go on to the bitter end, blotting out the consciousness of our intolerable situation as best we could, and the other to accept spiritual help. Those are the choices we have. Now, when people talk about choices, That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about being able to make choices in their lifestyle, in their way of living, and the things that they do. And many now these days are preaching this whole scenario of balancing their lives. Well, we mustn't fall into that trap. What does it mean if I say I'm going to balance my life? Does that not mean that I have forgotten what I asked God and promised to God in third step prayer? Let's read what it says. Page 63. Second paragraph, second line. God, I offer myself to Thee to build with me and to do with me as Thou wilt. Down at the end of that prayer, may I do Thy will always. Go down the next paragraph, 4 lines up in the bottom of the next paragraph, voicing it without reservation. In other words, when we did our third step, we withheld nothing. We offered ourselves to God like this. We said, God, I'm here. Take me and use me. Build with me and do with me as Thou wilt. One of the reasons we did that, we go to the page before on page 62, and we'll find out why we did that. Remember on page 62, we were led by the nose through a very uncomfortable revelation that our problems were of our own making, that they arose out of ourselves, that the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. And then it told us flat out, we have to be rid of this selfishness. We have to, or it'll kill us. That's a flat statement, but why is that so? Where does that come from? Well, go back to basics. It's simple. We're alcoholics. Alcoholism will kill us. If we don't stop drinking, we'll die. We can't stop drinking because we are powerless over alcohol. What is the solution? I have to get God between me and the booze. And if I'm still locked up in self, there's no room for God. It's that simple. We have to be rid of this selfishness. We have to, or it kills us. And then it tells us that we don't have any way of doing this on our own. We're going to need God's help. Now, as we are reading this and we're coming to understand and accept that this is true, this is a major metamorphosis in our thinking, because up until this time we'd been bound and determined that it was other people's fault, that we didn't have, we had a crappy life, and it was because of dysfunctional families and because of accidents of birth and color and brains and all kinds of stuff, and all these things that people have done to us, and no wonder we drank. And we've had all this human solutionists tell us that these are our triggers, this is the reason we drank. If we could just learn to control our feelings and be willing to be entitled to our feelings and all that stuff, that we wouldn't drink anymore. And all that was balderdash too. And so now we had to see that we got to be rid of this selfishness. It'll kill us. Now what does that amount to? It amounts to this. It tells us in the last paragraph. This is the how and why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. God, that should be obvious. What got us in here? We made the total and absolute complete mess of our lives. We were trying to run our lives to suit ourselves. We were making decisions based on self, which later put us in a position to be harmed. And then we wanted to blame the people who harmed us. So it didn't work to play God. And then here's the decision of the third step right here. This is the third step. It's not the prayer. The prayer implements the third step, but this is the third step. Here's the decision. Next, we decided that in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. He is the principal. We are His agents. He is the Father, and we are giving ourselves unconditionally to God. Now, what we do when we get sober for a while and we begin to get some money back and people are starting to trust us again and we're feeling good and our health has returned, suddenly we don't need this anymore. And our bright-eyed friends are always telling us, well, you got to get a life. You got to balance your life. And what are you doing? You become an AA junkie. You got this AA thing has become your new obsession. You know, a couple meetings a week, maybe, if you really need them. But let's get a life back, huh, Buster? I mean, well, we say, gee, that sounds wonderful. I'm feeling good, looking good, money starting to come in, everybody trusts me again. I got it made. I forget what the big book tells me about resting on my laurels, that I'm in deep trouble if I do, because alcohol is a subtle foe and it's just sitting there waiting for me. Those four horrible horsemen are out there doing drag races out here in a parking lot, waiting for us to decide to take our lives over again. And then people will say, and we encourage it if we haven't thought it through, I took my will back. No, that's not true. You didn't give it today. You see, the way this program works is that we turn our will over every day. As we go through the day. Why? Why do we have to do that? Why can't we just take the third step prayer and say, oh, I've given my will over? Because you and I, as human beings, are basically self-centered. That's the way we're built. Anything that happens, we take it in and we look first to see how it affects us, good or bad, or can I ignore it? This is the way we're built. And therefore, we're given the tools that we must have in order to effectuate a surrender as we go through each day. We find this all the way through the book. What do you want me to do next, God? What's my next step to be? My morning meditation. Show me what you want me to do, God, and I'll accept the answer. But please give me the power to carry it out. I recognize my humanness, and I recognize my weakness. And I recognize that I must take action every day to surrender. And so if I say, I have taken my will back, what I really mean is, I stopped giving it. And that's why one of the reasons that third step, the 11th step, is so critically important for us to take every day. Because you see, when we meditate, for example, meditation is one way that we surrender. We let go. We reach out for God. And whatever it is that is troubling us, whatever it is that we need help with, we give it over to Him and we seek His help with it. And whenever we work with others, we are putting ourselves beyond the pale of selfishness. Because, remember, in the fourth step it tells us where sex has become very troublesome, what we do is we turn our thoughts to someone we can help, because this quiets the imperious urge when to give in would mean heartache. And as we go through the day, the big book tells us that we are to consciously surrender. Thy will, not mine, be done. It tells us these are thoughts which must go with us constantly. That it is the proper use of our will, to will ourselves each day as we go through the day to surrender. There's not too much to ask. What are we talking about? We're talking about minuscule amounts of time which are of most critical importance to us. Because the moment that we forget that we dedicated our lives to God's will, and begin to live our lives again based upon our will, we find ourselves in deep, dark trouble again. Every time. So these are the things that we want to teach our sponsees, so that they understand that we have the tools and they're to be used every day. What's the 12th step say again? Practice these principles in all of our affairs. And we have the 10th step, 11th step, and the 12th step. And in the 10th step, and the 11th step, and the 12th step, we find all of the steps are incorporated in those steps to be used every day. And this is what we teach our people. And so when we start talking about taking our will back, or we start talking about balancing our lives, or all this other stuff, we have made a serious mistake. because we're ignoring the principle and the cardinal fact in our lives that if we don't stay in a state of surrender, we are vulnerable to alcohol. And being vulnerable to it means that we have no defense. I guess what you'd have to say is this: if you can teach your sponsees to do those things every day, which will allow them to stay securely in God's pocket, you're teaching them how to be free of alcohol the rest of their lives and to live a wonderful life that they could never ever imagine for themselves, because that's exactly what will happen. Another thing that we often run into is the idea that somehow or another it's critically important for us to get our sponsees healthy physically and help them to get on their feet financially, and especially to get them healthy physically before they can begin to accept the spiritual principles. And that's nuts. I mean, it's pure nuts. The big book tells us that just backwards. It tells us that spiritual recovery always precedes financial recovery, never follows it. It tells us that when the spiritual malady is overcome, then we straighten out mentally and physically, and that's the truth. That's exactly what happens. So these are the things that we teach our sponsees. The new person that you're going to be dealing with is a person who really is, when they get here, their basic idea is that they want to get their life back in order. I mean, that's their aim. That's why they're here. The big book tells us that's fine, but that's not the real reason we're here. It tells us the real reason we're here is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. Now that's kind of a bitter pill to swallow, I suppose, when you're new, but let's keep telling them, because this is the truth. If we stop and think about it rationally, we'll realize that there are 10 or 12 people out there right now, all around us, just like us, who haven't made it in here and never will. And they're doomed. And why are we here? I had no special merit to be here. I know that for a fact, and maybe some of you did. I don't know. Chances are you're just like me. Why is it that the second great miracle of our lives was worked? The first being when we were born, the second being when we walked in that door. Here's the truth. You and I have been graced with the opportunity to embrace a mission, a purpose in life. A real, honest-to-God purpose. And if we think back on our prior lives, we will realize that for the most part we drifted, we were aimless. It was kind of like this. You're born, life's a bitch, and you die. And so what? Why did you born me, Charlie? What is all of this? My main purpose has been to survive and to grab as much pleasure as I could while I'm still alive. But you and I have something priceless. We have a purpose, a reason, a mission. Bill Wilson called it our holy mission. I think he was right. Our mission is to be of maximum service to Him and the people about us. And to do this without any expectation or demand whatsoever for any kind of return. But the payoff, wow. First of all, we have a heritage. That heritage is there waiting for each and every one of us. That heritage is that we be happy, joyous, and free. And of those, freedom is the greatest of the gifts, because it means freedom from the bondage of self. We get to have that heritage if we're willing to work for it. We get to have our head in the clouds with God and our feet firmly planted on earth, where we can be of maximum service to God and the people about us. Now when we do this, when we accept the challenges of being a sponsor or of simply carrying a message with or without the title, it doesn't matter, what happens is that we are granted a life beyond anything we could ever have imagined for ourselves, and a life which we could not have purchased if we had $10 billion to spend. No human being can give it to us. We have to earn it. when we put in the work and follow the directions, whew, what a life. I feel so sorry for people who've never had the opportunities that we have. They just don't know. And we don't want to throw that miracle away, do we? We want to help our sponsees to recognize that they've been granted this great miracle and that they have to put some effort into this to preserve it. Now, when we start talking about the Big Book and its importance, we really need to look first at how it came to be. Why was it written? What is this book anyway? It seems to be commonplace today for people to look at the Big Book as if it were some sort of philosophical treatise which was promulgated by a bunch of middle-aged old white guys back in the late 30s, and that as such there's big parts of it which ought to be just disregarded, and especially the modern view seems to be that the Big Book has been superseded in so many ways by more modern thinking, by more modern writing, and by experience, and that we can safely ignore a good part of what's in the book. I guess maybe take those things we agree with and forget about the things we don't. And you know, in 1940 or 1941, it would have been certainly understandable for anybody to say, well, what do these guys know? You know, that there are only 100 of them that put this thing together, and there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of alcoholics out there, and all through the ages, every society has tried to deal with their alcoholics, and we've had some real smart professional people and scientists and doctors and so on and clergy in all of religions have been struggling to help the alcoholic, and these guys come along and they say, well, put that all aside because we found the answer. In fact, they even named one of their chapters, chapter 2, there is a solution. When, as a matter of fact, all the brightest minds and the most advanced thinking has said there's no solution. When an alcoholic gets to a certain point, there is no hope for them. They're simply not going to make it. And what we need to do is sweep them under the carpet, hide them out someplace, or warehouse them somewhere, because there's nothing anybody can do to help them. And until 1934, 1935, that was true. They didn't know how to help us. Nobody did. Dr. Silkworth ran the town's hospital for 20 years prior to that time, and he hadn't found any solution. And he had the most modern place in the country, maybe in the world, and had hundreds and hundreds, thousands of people went through that hospital. And he had everything at his disposal that modern science and modern medicine and psychiatric thinking could put there, and they still couldn't get the chronic alcoholic sober. These guys just didn't make it. And so he shoved them off to the side. He knew that they were hopeless. He knew that he was helpless to do anything for them. And he knew that they weren't going to stop drinking and that they would die from it. So along came this bunch, and they published this book in which they claimed to have found a solution. In fact, one of the co-founders, went so far as to say, in print, in the book, that it never fails. If we go about it with one half the zeal we used to go about getting our next drink. And so there was naturally a good deal of skepticism, and it was probably warranted to a certain extent back there in those days. But my gosh, this is 2003. This is 1940. Millions of alcoholics have already recovered using and following the directions found in this book. I mean, what more proof do we need than that? Not one word has ever been changed. It works just the same today as it did then. And so when we look at the book, we must not look at it as some sort of philosophical treatise. It's not a philosophy. It is not somebody's dreamed up methodology. It's not something that was written to get a PhD thesis done. Quite the contrary. The big book is a history. Do you ever think about it that way? It's a history. It tells us what happened to the people who wrote the book. That's the whole point of this book. To tell us what they did and how it worked for them and what happened to them. And so if we begin to read it as a history, then we can say to ourselves, well, either these guys were in some kind of a pipe dream, or they were lying deliberately, or just maybe this is actually what happened. They actually did this, and they actually recovered. And of course, when we view it from that standpoint, then it really begins to make a lot of sense. People say this is a we program. Well, it's actually a one-on-one program. And I guess the big reason for that is there's so much of the use of the we in the big book. That's because they're saying this is what we did. And then we look at the steps, and we is in the first step, and it's implied in all the other steps. And it's saying this is what we did to recover. It does not mean this is what we did together to recover. And quite obviously, they didn't do their 4 steps together, or their 5th steps together, or the 9th steps together. These are things which we do individually, and with our sponsors, or with our spiritual advisors, or with our support group. The we part of the program is something entirely different. It has to do with, as the traditions instruct us, that the unity of the fellowship is all important. And that's because we must hang together, or we'll all hang separately. And the reason for that is that as a society, we are able to support all of the vital functions which go into 12-step work. And 12-step work turns out to be one-on-one. The big book defines sponsorship in one sentence. Doesn't use the word, but this is what it means. That both you and the new man must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. It's 2 people growing spiritually together. That's the guts of our program. That's why when we do this workshop together, we're looking at that very most basic part of the AA program, which is the one person who has already experienced the steps working with someone who has not, and helping them to learn and teaching them how to work steps and encouraging them to do it and monitoring their progress, helping them to get to a point where they can stand on their own 2 feet and begin to trust God instead of other human beings, and be out there and then take over and get the reins themselves and start working with the next person that comes along. That's what the word pigeon means, by the way, the next to carry the message. Doesn't mean something that flies around and shits on your head. When I came in, we called them babies. And nobody thought too much about it then. Why, heck, if you came into a meeting when I started, the place would be so full of pipe, cigar, and cigarette smoke that you'd have to fan your way through in order to see where you're going. Nobody saw anything of it. We were there for recovery. It was just part of an AA meeting. But of course that's not politically correct anymore, so we don't do that. But the point that in those days the point was recovery, not personal comfort. Today, in so many of our teachings, the point is personal comfort, being comfortable. I've heard people say over and over again, all I want to do is be comfortable. Well, hell's bells. Read the book. Bill says the only way we're going to stay sober and to grow spiritually is to work and self-sacrifice for other people. Comfortability has nothing to do with it. We're in the age of feel-goodism. How many sponsors do you know now, when they do a 5th step with their sponsee, want to make sure they feel good about it, so they'll spend half the time telling the sponsee there's nothing wrong with them, Or, gee, look what I did. I mean, I did much worse than you. You're not nearly so bad as me, so don't feel so bad. Well, it's not the sponsor's fifth step, and it's not their place to do that at all. Big Book tells us what a fifth step is. It says we pocket our pride and go to it, illuminating every twist of character, every dark cranny of the past, because that's what must come out. The good stuff is not what's killing us. It's the bad stuff that's killing us. That's what we have to get out. In any event, when we look at the Big Book from the standpoint then of it being a history, then it begins to make a lot of sense. These guys are saying, and this is what they're saying. Here's what we did to recover from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And we truly believe that if you will do as we did, you too will recover. And they were right. If they weren't right, we wouldn't be here. Millions of alcoholics today in the program, all over the world. The Big Book translated in nearly 30 different foreign languages, 178 different countries, millions of recoveries going on, and at least 50 other 12-step groups out there. I mean, there's so darn many of them. If you lived in California today, I swear to you, if you didn't belong to a 12-step group, you'd be off the A list. Nobody'd ever invite you to a party. You wouldn't have any talk about it. So every human condition which is difficult to overcome now has a 12-step. Why? You've got to ask ourselves, why? It's very simple. The answer is right there, because it works. If these 12 steps as written, those 200 words which are changing the world, if they didn't work as written, we wouldn't be here. There'd be no AA, there'd be no NA, there'd be no Al-Anon, or any of these other 12 steps. There wouldn't be. The fact of the matter is that these 12 steps do work. And they work because they are spiritual principles. If you want to know what the 12 steps are, it's very simple. Go back into history. Go back into ancient scriptures. You will find these same spiritual principles enunciated and written about and preached about and articulated all through the centuries, through the eons. They've always been there. What's the difference? Why is it then that they work now? Why is it that they are so easily accessible now? It's simple, because in the Big Book, those spiritual principles are reduced to steps of action. And you see what happens is when we take the action, we incorporate those spiritual principles into our very being. They become the way we live our lives. We don't have to wonder how to be. All we have to know is what to do. And so when we pick up the Big Book and we look at the 12 steps, we find out what to do. What's the 12 steps say? Practice these principles in all of our affairs. It means to work these steps in everything we do. Then it gets to be real simple, real easy. And every time we dilute this, every time we derail it, every time we take these blind alleys, people are dying. We're pushing them in front of buses. We're not telling them the truth. We're telling them, I suppose, what we believe to be the truth. Human solutions do not work. They never worked. If human solutions worked, I guarantee you we wouldn't need AA. We wouldn't have to be here. If religious solutions work, we wouldn't need to be here. This spiritual solution is what does work, and it always has. Now that's what these guys were saying to us. In fact, when we get into Dr. Silkworth's opinion, we're going to find that he addressed this topic precisely because, you see, he, in the 3.5 years before he wrote his opinion, he'd been watching what was happening. He knew that what these AA guys were doing, he saw them doing it in his hospital over and over and over and over again. And he knew that what they were writing here was true because he'd watched them doing it. He'd seen the results. He had seen these hopeless, helpless alcoholics he had warehoused off in one corner of his hospital. He'd watched them sitting there, and he'd watched these AA guys come in and talk to them today and come in and talk to them again tomorrow. And then he'd see them praying together. And all of a sudden, this hopeless case was getting up and walking out of his hospital. And a month later, he'd be back talking to the next guy in the next bed. So he saw what was going on. And when he read this book, he said, these guys are telling the truth. Therefore, when he ended up his first little letter, he said that you can believe everything these men are saying about themselves. In other words, whatever they're telling you they did, they did. Whatever they're telling you about the results and what they will be is the truth. That's what happens. It was a wonderful endorsement that he gave them. But it was not something he was patting them on the back about. It was something that was true. Therefore, when we are studying the Big Book, we're studying a history which was written to show new people, what they needed to do to recover from a deadly, incurable, progressive illness. And showing it to them on the basis of what the people who wrote the book already had done. And if we view it from that standpoint, then as we study the Big Book, we're looking to see what they did. And we're looking to see when they did that, what happened to them. Now there's some other considerations as well as to why this book was written. You got to remember that in 1937, when they first were contemplating writing the Big Book, there were maybe 40 people altogether in AA at that time. And they were having a heck of a time trying to get the word out. It was very slow. Their growth was very slow. People were coming to meetings a lot, but they weren't sticking around. There were hundreds that came through the meetings from time to time. Some went out into their own home cities and so forth and actually got sober. And later, when the Big Book was published and they began to show up and groups began to form all over the place, they realized that they were so small that there was no way that they could reach out and touch these hundreds and thousands upon thousands, probably millions of cases out there, and they knew they had a solution now. They knew it worked. So they decided that they needed to publish a book. Now, if you look at it from that standpoint, then you'll see that the book was being written and was going to be published for the new person. It was to go out to Cucamonga, California, and to Pierre, South Dakota, and down in Baton Rouge, and even into some of the boroughs of New York, wherever there were alcoholics. And it was to be the book which would carry the message to the person who still suffered when he was looking for a solution. It was also designed to educate the rest of the non-alcoholic population so that they would have some idea what was wrong with us and what we needed. It was also designed to bring comfort to the families because they knew by that time that alcoholism was a family disease. And so therefore there was a very carefully written chapter to the wives to help the wives understand their role in this recovery, and a chapter to the family to show the family how they were to adjust themselves. And in both instances, you remember that there was a tremendous emphasis on the family also adopting a spiritual way of life because they realized by that time that that was what was going to work. And then another very carefully worked out chapter to employers to try to teach employers what could be done from the workplace to help the newcomers. And in all of these chapters, even though they had this specific target, we find tremendous amounts of first step material. Now, if I want to talk to a wife, for example, about her husband and what she needs to do to help in his recovery and to help herself because she was suffering too, a lot of that chapter is going to be explaining the alcoholic to her. Same way in the family afterward. Much of that chapter talks about the alcoholic. It's really talking about you and me. In the chapter of the employers, again, it's the same thing. Telling the employer what he's got out here with these alcoholic employees and how perhaps he can help them. Now, I suppose in the average Big Book, if you had a $1,000 bill and you put it in a chapter to employers, nobody'd ever find it. You probably would forget where you put it yourself. But you see, that's wrong, because that chapter is full of absolute jewels. And part of what we do here as we study the Big Book and try to see where everything is and how it all ties together is that we will look at these chapters with some detail and see what's there. Now, if I'm going to write a book which is aimed at the newcomer, what am I going to concentrate on? Now, we put ourselves in that place and we'll come up with the same answer they did. First, we look to see, what is this disease? It's a disease of denial, isn't it? So anything else that we're going to do here, above everything, we're going to have to write a book which will break down the walls of denial, will help this new person, this suffering person, to come to terms with the fact that they in fact have this illness, to help them to become somewhat open-minded and be willing to accept the possibilities. But how are we going to do that? Well, the quickest way to do that is to get them to identify themselves with us. So therefore, we're going to reveal ourselves in great detail so that they can see what we went through and how that affected us, and then they can see how we recovered. And so we're going to do enough of this that somewhere in this book every newcomer is going to find themselves. So we start out with Bill's story, which is every man's story. It's every alcoholic story. It's a universal alcoholic story. And that's where the identification process will start. And then as we go along, we've got the story of Jim and the story of Fred that we find in chapter 3, and the allegory of the jaywalker, which, by the way, is very, very pointed. And when you're working with your sponsees, you ask them to read those 3 paragraphs carefully, because they can see themselves in this guy who couldn't stop jaywalking. He kept getting hit and injured and lost his job and lost his wife and kept on swearing off jaywalking, couldn't stop, and finally he got hit by a fire engine or something and it broke his back, and that was the end of him. But you could follow his odyssey through the days when he could jaywalk with impunity. You can just imagine this guy standing out there in the middle of the Avenue of Americas playing Toreador with the taxi cab, psh, psh. And he got away with it for years, and then all of a sudden he lost a little bit of his edge, maybe a little of his peripheral vision. He wasn't quite as quick as he was before, and he started getting winged, and he started getting crushed, and eventually he got nailed. And all along the way, he wanted to quit jaywalking, but he didn't know how. He couldn't. Even though he lost everything, and he knew what was going to happen. If he didn't get out of the street, he was going to be killed, and he couldn't. We have the story of Roland Hazard. He's not identified, but it's a very important story because it is where one of the keystones of AA, and it demonstrates one of the most important points that we find in the early chapters of the Big Book. Namely, that self-knowledge will not keep us sober. And thereby hangs a major tale, because the human solutionists would insist that if we just know enough about ourselves and why we drink, and all those triggers and those well springs, and if we can just straighten out our emotions and our feelings and so forth, we won't drink anymore. And balderdash. It doesn't work. And hell, if that was all it took, we wouldn't need AA. And we saw the story of Roland Hazard, who was with Dr. Jung for a year in Switzerland, being psychoanalyzed. He knew everything about himself. When he came back to the United States, he knew he'd never drink again. He knew so much about himself and about why he drank. It was quite clear he'd never drink again, and within a month or so he was drunk. Finally, Dr. Jung had to tell him, I can't help you. You're one of those chronic alcoholics, and nobody can help you. The only thing that's going to help you is to have a complete spiritual awakening, a spiritual experience, a complete psychic change, he told him. And Jung was right. I mean, he threw up his hands, and so did Silkworth. Silkworth knew he couldn't help the chronic. He knew it. And so we've got these stories, and they are very helpful. And there are a couple of other allusions as we go through the first 11 chapters to real people and what happened to them. But You see, when they got to the end of that, they said, but we're going to have to make sure that the alcoholic who reads this book is going to be able to identify themselves with somebody, a real person, in order to help them to overcome their denial. And so they decided to add a bunch of personal stories in the back of the book. Now, if we look at it from that standpoint, we can see how critically important those stories are for somebody new. They were written for the newcomer. They were written for the newcomer to be able to identify themselves with real alcoholics who reveal themselves and all of their travails with alcoholism and then show how they recovered. Well, now that's the other side of the coin. The big book is designed to help the newcomer overcome and break down the walls of denial, and on the other hand, to bring them hope. Because remember, we're dealing with a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body here. And so, all the way through the big book, we have one chapter after another which concentrates on positive statements, promises that if you do this, this will happen. Just think what the 12 steps says. Maybe the greatest promise of all. That if you work these 12 steps, you will have a spiritual awakening. Tonight, when we read chapter 5, I don't know, did we read chapter 5? Maybe I wasn't paying attention. Huh? How it works, yeah. The 3 pertinent ideas. There's a great promise. We just run right by it sometimes. Maybe we're not thinking what it's saying. That we're alcoholic, can't manage our own lives. No human power is going to take away our alcoholism. In other words, no human power is going to relieve us of the obsession, compulsion to drink, which is what keeps us going. That's the insanity. But that God can and will if we seek Him. That's a tremendous promise. God will relieve us of the obsession and compulsion to drink alcohol if we seek Him. And then you ask yourself, well, okay, how do I seek God? Well, it's right there. You work the steps. Well, you know that. How do you know that? Because 12 steps says that as a result of working these steps, you're going to have a spiritual awakening. And right there in the 10th, between the 10th and 11th steps, it tells us we will be restored to sanity. We will enter the world of the Spirit. We will become God conscious, and we'll develop a vital sixth sense, which means that we have developed an actual connection with God. You see? So it's all right there. And these promises, if they're read and understood